Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is your host, Ilana Levin, aka Ilana Brooklyn, and this is a comics and culture podcast. This is the show for people who know Stonewall veterans are the real superheroes among us and still need our support. And joining me today is the man who brought Pride Was a Riot to an all-ages comic for kids about space rocks and love. Yes, it's Twitter's own Mea Culpa, aka Anthony Oliveira. Anthony is a writer, film programmer, pop culture critic, and PhD living in Toronto. He is the host of the Review Cinema's Dumpster Raccoon film series, a recurring guest on the CBC's National Pop Panel and the Toronto Independent Film Fest's Red Carpet and events, while his pieces have appeared in the Washington Post, Hazlitt, Extra, Torontoist, and others. His comic book work includes writing for Dark Horse, the Cartoon Network Steven Universe, and and also Marvel, but we can't talk about that quite yet.
Oh, wait, breaking news. We can now announce that he is writing a story in the comic War of the Realms, War Scrolls, that is going to be released May 29th. The story is called My Drag Brunch with Loki, and it features Hulkling and Wiccan.
He can be found on Twitter at MEAKOOPA, that's Mea Culpa, where he tweets about art, politics, and LGBTQ culture, and on his podcast, The Devil's Party, as he reads through Milton's Paradise Lost and its demonic twists and turns. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. That was I just love to hear people talk about how great I am. So this is already perfect.
Well, I love to have you on the show. This is you were someone who works right at the intersection of pop culture and social change and critical work and also pedagogy as a teacher. And now you also have comics that we can talk about. So as soon as I saw the announcement that you were going to be writing a Steven Universe comic, I was like, you have to come on my show. And now it's happening.
Oh, always a pleasure. I mean, and I'll be back when there's a new Star Wars too, because we have to talk about the next one. That's the last thing we were on about, right? Yeah.
That's right. We talked about the Star Wars. Yes. So listeners can go back and give that a listen.
It was the first time I ever sat in a movie theater and made notes as the film was going, because it was just it was fresh in theaters, and I was like the dork in my notebook writing things down.
Oh man. So just a real quick for our listeners, the synopsis of this comic in question, which is Steven Universe Fusion Frenzy #1. Wait, does that mean there's going to be #2?
It is as far as I know, it is a one shot. But if you're current with the show, you know that the sort of what felt like a series finale but wasn't quite one introduced quite a lot of new fusions. So there is material to write a second one, but it is meant to be sort of like an anthology collection about each of the fusions that we know so far.
Got it. So the blurb description is, it's time for the fusions to shine in this 40-page special. The fan favorite Steven Universe fusions get the spotlight as Stevonnie, Garnet, Smoky Quartz, Opal, Sujolite, and Sujolite take Beach City in on 5 fantastic tales. I was really impressed by this. Your comic, really impressed by the one about Smoky Quartz and having their identity get recognized.
There's a nice little dead naming question that comes up in that one, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I really like that one too.
So let's start by talking about how did you get into Steven Universe as a viewer in the first place, and then how did that connect you to working on this project?
Oh, I remember the first time I started clocking Steven Universe was at comic conventions, and I kept seeing these bright, colorful cosplays and not knowing what they were, but noticing how queer its fan base was, which is something I try to keep my ear to the ground about. And then I went and watched it and I immediately fell in love. I mean, it's doing so much of the stuff that interests me. It's sort of, I feel like when I'm done the Paradise Lost podcast, I have to go and do the dealing with the Jewish and Christian imagery and iconography that Steven Universe seems to me to be obsessed with, because it is about sort of rebellion and about this strange Miltonic, the hard lightness of the gems. So I've been obsessed for a long time, and I just sort of made a big spectacle of being a super fan of it online and cosplaying as Steven all the time. And eventually, I guess they were just if you cosplay as something enough, they will hire you to write it, is the lesson, I think, here.
Oh, wow. I've I dress up as Alice Cooper a lot, and he hasn't called me, but there's
well.
always time. But you're a writer who's worked in comics a little bit before as well.
Yeah, not a lot. Actually, Steven Universe, through a weird production schedule trick of fate, is the first of my work that's going to has hit the page. The next one is the Shout Out Anthology, which is like a queer genre collection that's coming out in May. That actually was the first thing I wrote as a comic, but just because it had to be kickstarted and because it doesn't have because it's all queer, it doesn't have the major backing you'd love. It has taken longer to get into production, but we massively overfunded and it's all ready to go. But Steven Universe is the first thing I've written that's printed for the page. Circuitously, like, I don't have the kind of career where you're like, well, that guy's going to write comics someday. Like, I came out of academia. I did a PhD in Renaissance literature. So even like the concept of the novel is a new form for me, much less a comic book.
Yeah.
But I grew up reading, like, I was an X-Men kid from the age of 8. Like, I set 3 different alarms so that I could watch the X-Men comic the X-Men cartoon in 1992. Like, and that, the queerness of comic books has always been so important to me too. Like, even before I knew what I was, before I knew what queerness was, I knew that there was something about what the X-Men were doing that felt congruent to my own lived experience. And I get very frustrated when comics don't honor that sort of queer minority existence in their tradition. Like, sort of tired of about us without us comics, right? Like, for 40 years, white straight men have written all these allegories for minority existence. So I want to turn.
It's definitely, and in some cases, like when they began doing it, if you're looking at decades and decades far enough in the past, they were, like being Jewish, like it was more indicative of their life experience, but that's not the case. Who's doing it now or in these particular identities.
And it's not as though the industry has kept pace either, right? Like,
no.
The refrain you hear for the movies, for the comics, over and over and over again is international markets, right? That the world isn't ready for it, and therefore the industry gets to be conservative. And I think it's time to, if nothing else, what the success of this sort of one shot and what the success already of the Shout Out Anthology says, which has nothing to do with me, is because people are hungry for these stories. People, if you go to a Comic-Con, you've seen it 100 times, right? You see this rabid queer fan base that is queering these texts and that is finding subtext in these texts and is spending all their money in Artist's Alley because Artist's Alley is producing the queer content, and the big two and beyond are still so reticent to tap that market.
Yeah, and often when they even have opportunities right in front of them, they don't understand them, see them, or jump on them because of the homophobia and the lack of cultural intelligence, I think, about what fandom looks like.
It is getting better. I mean, I'm starting to make inroads. I am receiving the invites, which is nice to get. There is a desire to see these stories go into production. There is a desire to see these stories brought to fulfillment, but these are huge leviathans, and they turn very slowly, I guess.
And I think that's one of the things I love is, you're saying that like what made you see Steven Universe was the large queer fandom, and then to see that in a show that is itself queer and like made by queer people, and is not just limited and it's not just LGBTQ subtext, but is textually such is, and for kids, like really proves the point that if it can be done in a very commercial medium, at like by Viacom, basically, then
I mean, I don't know how apocryphal the stories are about Steven Universe's inception, but I don't think it's a secret that Sugar was quite frustrated on Adventure Time, because that is another text that, where the subtext was rapidly becoming the text about how queer Marceline and Princess Bubblegum's relationship was, and then it was sort of kept at bay for so long that Steven Universe is sort of the wellspring breaking out somewhere else, right? Like, well, screw you, I'll make my own queerness, right? And I think that there is. I think that, I mean, working as I did for so long on the whitest, straightest, oldest, deadest white men, there is something to be said for queering the canon, and there is something to be said for making your own texts. And I think both are important strategies that go hand in hand. And I mean, we've been waiting, there have been Marvel movies for 19 years, and now they're like the first queer hero. It's like kids have stopped being kids in the time you made them wait, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
it's nice to see these texts spring up, fully formed, and be those texts that don't otherwise exist. I'm so happy. I'm so glad that Rebecca Sugar made this sandbox for me to play in, even for as little as I got to so far.
I mean, that's the interesting thing too, right? Like, for a lot of us, being able to have these like official queer characters in media, when we didn't really get to have that as children. And, you know, there's lots of entertainment that is aimed at adults that has LGBTQ characters in it that means nothing to me. A lot of it even made by queer women, and it means nothing to me. And it's like, I don't, and it's your range, you know, it's not genre that I like. It's, you know, music is wrong, the aesthetic is off, something is just doesn't connect. And so I think, like, I don't think that the affection that I have for Steven Universe in particular, but, you know, also for Adventure Time, now that, especially with it having cleared up any ambiguities in its finale there. But like,
that's how you have to do it these days, right? Is like, these cartoons always have that last, I don't know if I can swear, like that last screw you in the final seconds. Like Legend of Korra did the same thing, where it's like, well, you watched the whole thing and guess what?
They're dirty bisexuals.
And to your point, like, it's true that sometimes these texts exist that don't speak to us, but also these texts exist that are for adults, right? Like, what's nice about
we're
these
adults.
What's nice about these texts though is like there is nothing inherently adult about being queer, and that I think is what's important to something like Steven Universe. Like, it is not something, I mean, so much, we were so worried about this comic pressing up against international censors because it's adult content, and like, what kind of rainbow flag will they let you get away with, et cetera, and it's such an important, and like, it's annoying you have to keep saying it, but you do. Like, being queer is not necessarily an adult narrative, right?
No. I mean, but it's just interesting to me that I feel like the places that I've seen the most interesting and compelling, like, queer characters for a lot of folks who I know is in media aimed at all ages, whether it's like Lumberjanes or Steven Universe. Like, it's not even like the quote adult quote focused work isn't really making it to us very well.
Yeah, I mean, there's something elemental about, I mean, there's something mythic about like all ages content, right? Like, I have one of the tweets I still deal with years later. I tweeted about how like adult fiction is like, I am dismayed by my life. Shall I cheat on my wife perhaps? And like, meanwhile YA is like, it's time to overthrow the government and then overthrow its Maoist successor, right? Like, I think that I think that as much as there's so much interesting things to say about the adult turn to YA in our contemporary moment, one of the reasons is because YA is sort of refuses to be cynical about the changeability of the world, in a way that adult fiction is like, well, I've given up on real change. I'll either just deal with like interpersonal drama, or I'll imagine these dystopian, like my least favorite genre is, there's ways to do it right, but I just can't stand zombie stuff because it's sort of about like the fantasy of like, well, what if everything just collapsed and I could just shoot my fellow man in the face, right? Like, I don't care for those things, and there is something utopian. I mean, that last image in Steven Universe's last episode is, as I was tweeting about, like, it's straight out of like Angels in America. It's straight out of Jewish apocalyptic literature. This sort of like this remaking of the world, this sort of millenarian moment where everyone bathes in the fountain of Bethesda. Like, you don't get that in adult fiction because it's too risky. It's too uncynical, it's too out there, it's too out on a limb, and it's easy to poke fun at and suggest there's something infantilizing about optimism, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it's definitely it's definitely a reason that a lot of people are turned off from books that are aimed at an adult market. And but I don't want to unfairly say like, oh, like modern literary fiction isn't like the stuff that gets the most coverage and the most readers is like very straight, white, and male, but that's not actually like everything that's out there. I think that there's a lot of energy in genre that is not necessarily like happening in other spaces. I think personally also, I came of age just as a queer person in the like mid and late 90s. And
right. Yeah, I think that part of that is generational. I think you and I have scars based on when we came of age that maybe kids now don't have. They don't have to deal with there is to me though something sad, like soothing about the sad gay narratives, because I felt like a sad gay for a long time. I couldn't imagine a horizon of utopianism, and it's why it's so important to me to imagine. Like I watch these queer kids having their little promposals, and it's like, does it give me a cavity? Yes, but also like it's a horizon of being I couldn't even imagine as a child, and like the kids get to imagine all kinds of new narratives that I didn't get to, and I'm very jealous and very excited for them for that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that brings you to the question: is like, is our love of Steven Universe because we missed out on queer media as a child, or is it because the text is so complex and stands as art in its own right?
That's such a good question.
You can say both.
I spent a summer at sounds like a brag, but it is relevant. I spent a summer at Cornell studying near Catherine Bond Stockton. Stockton is like a queer theorist, but the main thrust of her theory is about a concept she calls the ghostly gay child. And the ghostly gay child is the idea that a queer child is something you never are. It's something you were, and you recover retroactively. I was thinking about it a lot recently with Stranger Things. The character of, I think his name is Will, the sort of kid who goes missing, who's sort of the impetus for all the events, who's clearly, if you're queer, you watch it and you're like, oh, that kid is coded as queer, right? He's being bullied, he's being called fag, and he has sort of this like pull to fellow male cast member. It's like there's something going on there, but of course Will doesn't think of himself as queer. Will doesn't have a way to theorize his own queerness, and I think that especially like people of our generation, like we had to retroactively figure it out, whereas the kids now, like the bar I work for, later this month we're having a drag kids night where like the kids are going to come out in drag, and it's like that is like a horizon of being none of us could even figure. And I think it's interesting to think about whether this ghosty gay child is still a thing or not.
Yeah, wow, definitely. So when you were, I think like the particular comic that you worked on, Fusion Frenzy, is Steven Universe in general is, has LGBTQ characters and is full of LGBTQ themes, but Fusion Frenzy is really full of stories about queerness. Like it's like the focus of the issue, basically. So like I don't feel like any story I've seen in it isn't like either, like in the case of your story, it's like literally the gems go to a pride parade. And other stories are a bit more on the metaphor plane, but like one of them is about being not just being dead named, but I think also like somebody not recognizing like that you're embodying, like that you're not the same person that you were, in terms of like them having you in your head as the whole like, oh, I've lost my daughter, like when someone, when tells their parents that they're trans, etc. That whole thing.
And there's the story about Sugalite has like, actually, like it's sort of about like the danger, they're not quite dangers, but like the edges, the different ways of sexuality. Like it's about thinking about like relationships that aren't quite toxic, but require a talking through, or like to me, it has sort of like almost like a poly kind of question behind it. And then there's the one about Garnet's first like first fusion and like negotiating the terms of love, like and I don't think that was by design. At least when they came to me, they did not pitch it as a story about queerness. I think that just fusion, more than anything in the Steven universe world, speaks to that, activates all those metaphors, right? Like when they said, they came to me and they said, well, we're doing this thing about fusion, which fusion would you want to write about? And they gave me the list. Do you have a story you'd like to tell? And I gave them 2 pitches, one of which had nothing to do with any queer content at all, really. And which maybe one of these days we'll get to adapt into something a bit longer. But and then I gave them this one, and they were all about this one. The pitch I gave was basically Steven goes to his first Pride parade. The secret pitch behind it was I actually wanted to think about the Pulse massacre. That's sort of because the question is, when they ask me about fusion, well, what does fusion mean to me? Fusion is about visibility. Fusion is about the risks of being out in public spaces, because that's how everyone responds when they see Garnet at least the other gems who know what she is immediately recognize her to be a fusion. She's sort of living an out life. And what are the risks of that? I want to think about. So it's about a pride parade that is attacked by forces that do not want pride parades to exist, which unfortunately are quite familiar to us now. Someone on Twitter renamed the scorpion that attacks the pride parade in my story Mike Pince, which I think
that's so good. Well, I just thought it was so smart how they had it be a disruptor on his tail. Like the disruptors are used to break apart gems and fizzle fusions out. And I thought that was such a smart design.
I gave it notes about it being a scorpion with the disruptor in its tail, and I gave it a name. I sort of like invented a backstory for this category of gem, but you can't just invent gem categories. So Cartoon Network asked us to walk that one back. So you'll notice Pearl seems to know what it is, but doesn't quite say in the comic. She doesn't name it. But Mike Pince works fine for me.
Mike Pince, breaking up the Pride Parade.
And of course, Stevonnie. Like if you give me any choice, I would want to write about this. I guess there is something about Stevonnie's youth, and Stevonnie's still figuring it out that made it for me the character that I had to put my finger on. I had to think about for a minute, which is why I wanted them to be the center of this story.
I've had so many people tell me, like, when I had an episode about the Steven Universe season finale, Jameson Henderson was saying, like, this is like the first character that's non-binary that they'd seen on television that had any significance to them at all, and they're not, Stu Jameson being non-binary. Like, this is like Nichelle Nichols being in Star Trek. Like, this is like the first. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Steven Universe didn't have to be about, it didn't have to for the sake of telling its story, did not have to depict a non-binary character. It didn't have to depict a queer wedding, right? Like, the metaphorics made it quite clear what these things were about. And what I really admire about the show and what I really wanted to do in this story was make the subtext into text, right? Like, we're not going to obfuscate or metaphorize these things away, that we will acknowledge the non-binary existence of Stevonnie. We will acknowledge pride parades, right? Like, one of the great moments, I spent the 90s and the 2000s saying, well, obviously Iceman is queer, and having it canonically happen, as much as I grew up being like, the canon doesn't matter, you queer the canon yourself, like, having the relief of having it be fact and not having to do that fight anymore, not having to keep the files on hand anymore, and suddenly it becomes the job of all these haters out there to make the counterclaim instead, is such a relief. And having that mattered to me. Is like, the most important part of that comic to me was turning that page and seeing that parade and knowing when you see it what it is, and recognizing that we're not going to play a shell game anymore.
Yeah. And someday I'll have that moment with Kitty Pryde.
Gosh.
Not yet.
Who do you have a particular ship for Kitty? What do you?
Oh,
are you Liliana? Is that?
Yeah, I am. I mean, even though, like, I respect Chris Claremont, like, being like, no, it's actually written to be Rachel, because but the fact that he even would say that, like, the fact that this, like, comics veteran because comics veterans are even beyond the position where they could be threatened or hurt by the corporations, are still scared to freaking say this shit. But the fact that Claremont was like, no, I wrote her as a love relationship with Rachel. Like, I give that credence, but that's,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really admire. Did you read his Magneto one shot the other day? Magneto Black. Yeah, it was like a one story, and it's like, I don't know how old Chris Claremont is, but he's up there now. He doesn't have to keep pushing the envelope, and it's literally just about Magneto going to the Mexican border and dealing with these concentration camps that America is currently running. Oh my god, I love you, Chris Claremont. Yeah, and it's like it's not a metaphor. It's very clearly that's what it is. I mean, there's a mutant angle, of course. That's why Magneto's involved. Yeah. But he goes to, and I mean, he's never subtle, right? Like the Magneto, of course, like rolls up his sleeve and you see his tattoo and all those things. But to have that comic out there in kids' hands and be like, this is the crisis now. This is what these comics are for. Instead of the usual, like, I mean, like the no more mutants and all these things, these sort of ways to control the populace of to make sure the metaphor never reaches the level of the surface, right? I miss the Grant Morrison days. Like, no, it's about queer culture. It's about mutant culture. It's about what would that look like. It's about imagining a new way of theorizing and practicing your mutancy, right? Like, that to me was a very exciting period in Marvel.
It was about
comics.
Beast saying he doesn't know if he wants to date humans anymore.
Yeah, those are to me, the X-Men are the most interesting when they are actually about, like, intramural politics in the way that you and I know queerness is constantly dealing with that. And like the moment in X2 where it's like, yeah, you fight Magneto, but when the Sentinel or whatever shows up, you both turn and fight that thing, right? Like, that to me is when X-Men is most at its most interesting, but it's the thing that straight white men don't know how to write because they don't know what minority politics are actually like when the rubber meets the road.
Yeah. Boy, that's true. So, like, this was your first, comic that came out, but, like, what was your process of, working with a licensed, characters and, like, figuring out what you would be able to do within the story? And, like, dude, I see this Mr. Smiley, on the Pride Parade float. Like, not Nana is on the Pride Parade float because she's the mayor. Like, that doesn't mean anything in particular. But, like, Mr. Smiley is, he's sponsored like the donut float, and like I think Mr. Smiley and Mr. Frowny were a couple, and I just think this is proof that this is what that was.
Yeah, but I was very I mean, Ver, my artist on this, who is also non-binary,
cool.
I think they hate me because because
like,
I
draw
scripted
everybody.
Yeah, like no artist wants to read the page the description that I wrote for that page, and it was there was, of course, dealing with licenses is always fraught because the notes were always like, well, you'll notice, like, I did try to make it sort of a Where's Waldo of all the characters, but some of them couldn't be there for various reasons. Like, Lapis is not there because apparently in the moment in the timeline this is set, Lapis is on the moon. So we couldn't have Lapis there. Notes like that were quite bristling. They were there throughout. Every panel, we had to be careful to get things right. We had to think about, well, will this panel be printable in some countries? And there were conversations had for sure. Also, like, I can completely understand that they don't want the tail to wag the dog, right? Like, there's a line you can take a comic to, but if the property is principally a cartoon, you have to let the cartoon lead the way in a lot of ways. So a lot of discussions were had, but I'm very proud of where we ended up with everything, even though I do kind of wish Lapis was in the mix. I also couldn't have Bismuth because Bismuth wasn't... Bismuth has to be off-site. Yeah, I think it was a bubbling... I mean, I don't really understand when even this... They know better than I do when this comic is set, I guess. Sure. To me, it was set in a sort of no man's land where all the characters were available. But I was quite insistent Mr. Smiley be leading the parade because I do think of the human characters, he is the most obviously queer-coded.
Yeah.
And he's also pretty wealthy. He can afford to sponsor a float, right?
Definitely. And also, like, the parade is kicked off by dykes on bikes.
Very important to me. Yeah, I was very insistent on that. Well, actually, one of the characters we couldn't have was the mystery woman, the pink
mystery woman.
Yeah, apparently. Now
I understand, though. I understand.
Apparently, the mystery is the most important thing about her. I think I can say that, and therefore the note was that she could not appear. But nevertheless, I was like, well, the dykes on bikes have to be there because they were so important to me. Even at a moment when I went through the same phase I think everybody does, where you're like, oh, I'm gay, but like I'm not like that, you know. I'm not. It's not the main thing about me, and which now is the most painful moment to remember. But I understand it as a coping strategy. But seeing things like the dykes on bikes, seeing so much of the Pride Parade as sort of like a refusal to apologize. I mean, I guess now the kids are calling it a Ring of Keys moment, right? Like to recognize a queer aesthetic that is not the same as a straight aesthetic, that is not even necessarily sexually charged, but is a different set of iconographies and a different activation of semiotics, to me matters a lot. And the dykes on bikes are such an important part of the Pride Parade for me that I was like, no, we have to have them no matter what.
I guess to anyone who is confused or lives in a city that has a Pride Parade that I don't understand, traditionally Pride Parades are led off by dykes on bikes, which is a queer women motorcycle contingent.
Yeah, because you, of course, like Pride was a riot, as Garnet says in the comic. You can't trust the police to protect you, so you need a version of a security force. And what better than like a butch lady on like a massive bike to lead the parade, right? Like there's no ignoring it sonically, there's no ignoring it visually. So they would clear the path for these sort of whether or not the parade had a license. The dykes on bikes made sure that there was space for the floats and the dancers, etc. So and there's still, Toronto certainly has them leading the way still.
Yeah, New York, DC as well.
It's the only time all year I'm not annoyed by a motorcycle, actually.
You also have the amazing line of that didn't stop Garnet from throwing some rocket punches back in the disco fries.
Yes, Amethyst does get distracted by the disco fries. She does not finish the anecdote she's about to tell.
But we know that Garnet was at Stonewall.
I don't. The interesting question to me, of course, I had to think about the deep lore here quite a lot. Like, it's one of the reasons the Pride. It was a discussion we had about, well, would the Pride Parade necessarily look the same? The Pride flag. At first, it was a question of legality, but the Pride flag is fair use. But it's interesting when you think about Steven Universe as a text. What, like, in one of the comics, they show a Canadian flag, but it's green. Whereas the South Korean flag appears at one point on the TV show as is. So it's like, would the rainbow flag have emerged the same way? And the question we also had was, did Stonewall necessarily happen the way that, like, because is there a New York even is a question? Because there seems to be Empire City. But to me, anyway, certainly there have been, there's no version of history that wouldn't have conflict between queer communities and their oppressors. And wherever those conflicts have happened, to me, Garnet has shown up once or twice to to throw a rocket punch or two. I'm not saying she definitely threw the first rocket punch at Stonewall.
Yes, she did not throw the first punch.
No, but she's
know who did that, actually. But she was through a punch that was rocket fueled.
She threw, yes, exactly, yeah.
No, I think that's striking the right balance. I think that's striking the right balance. Like, you don't want to overwrite the actual heroism of actual people in actual history, but you can place these iconic characters in the story along with the real people as a way to sort of heighten and make it clear, like, the heroism of the moment that was there, and put the story in a historical context. I think that's exactly the right way to do it.
And it was important to me to, yes, it is political to suggest that these children's heroes fought police at Pride. That is the implication there, right? That if there is a riot, they're fighting somebody. But to say that, yes, that is political, but it is also to say that, well, that is the right side to be on, right? Like, a hero who, I mean, Captain America fighting in World War II is political too. And it makes a statement to say that it made a statement at the time and it makes a statement now. Weirdly, it makes quite a loud statement now because the Nazis are back. But these political statements are worth the saying, even though I do feel like the comic winks as it says it, because I don't know. I didn't try to get it put in more explicitly than that. It was, to me, what mattered was the wink.
I also think Disco Fries could be a stand-in for the 70s.
Yeah, I think that, I mean...
Because it was Disco Fries.
I used Disco Fries really specifically. I liked the 70s activation, but I also liked the sort of the party vibe they suggest. I knew that most people wouldn't know what Disco Fries were, but...
Oh, really?
When you hear the phrase... Yeah, I had a lot of the tweets were about, like, what are Disco Fries?
Wow.
In Canada,
I
it's
sure am
poutine.
Regional, I suppose.
Yeah.
But...
Where are you from? Because people from
New York
like
and DC.
Oh, see. Yeah, exactly. Like New Jersey, New York, people knew what Disco Fries were, but a lot of people didn't. But yeah, I figure they're like, you know, they're boardwalk trash there, right? Like Beach City is a boardwalk. They would certainly have Disco Fries, but maybe not every day. But if the Frymans are there, they're going to serve them. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, you know, we actually had a conversation talking about it. You know, I've been arguing correctly, I might add, that obviously Beach City is Dewey Beach and in Delaware, because the state they're in is called Delmarva, which is the actual acronym for Delaware, Maryland, Virginia as a region. And Mayor Dewey Beach and Rebecca Sugar is like from there, but also Dewey Beach is adjacent to Rehoboth. Rehoboth is one of the oldest gay beach towns in the country. So the fact that there's a pride parade there is like, well, of course, it's like Rehoboth. Like growing up in DC, like people would be like, oh, I'm going to go to Rehomo this summer, and be like, yay, have fun. You know, like we didn't go to the Fire Island like that. I'm not from New York originally. Like, you know, people wouldn't go to Fire Island. People would go to Rehoboth, aka Rehomo. And like Rehoboth is still rather gay, but it's not as gay as it was. Like when you're walking down through town and you see the memorial plantings of all the different benches that have been dedicated to people from the community over the years, and then you hit where the AIDS crisis happened, and you're like, oh fuck, and then you sort of cry hysterically because everybody has a bench named after them who died in the early 90s, and those people were all like 35. But yeah, so Rehoboth is not as gay as it was, but it is still quite gay.
Yeah, I didn't. I was pretty specific about not wanting it to be like an urban pride parade. Like, I did want it to sort of walk along the beach side. I kind of had. I was in New Orleans for a Easter, which is New Orleans kind of has 4 pride parades a year, and one of them is the Easter parade.
I love them.
And it's like the Easter parade there is horse-drawn carriages. But I did want it to have oh gosh. I'm blanking now. What is that coastal pride? Providence. I was thinking about Providence a lot too. Like I wanted it to have that. I mean, I literally pulled up maps as they exist of Beach City, and I was like, okay, it's definitely going to come around this corner, and then it's going to go along the waterfront. And that to me, I wanted it to be small town and beachy. And if you look in the distance, you can see the whole wrestling team is there. It seems to be an important part of Beach City culture.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's very important to show that this isn't just happening in cities, and it's also true. You know. Yeah,
I also wanted like some corporate sponsorship insofar as Mr. Smiley is sort of the corporate presence in town, but I wanted it to feel homegrown-y. Like I have Greg pulling the float with the band behind it. Like I wanted it to feel the way I miss the way Pride used to feel, you know, like instead of all these corporate floats and uniformed marching cops.
No, I don't go to corporate Pride, but I live in New York, so like we have the Dyke March, you know.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know that every city has the same.
And I think Ver did an amazing job of not just putting all the characters we know in the parade, but depicting a lot of people we don't know and really want to know, right? Like I'm fascinated by so many of the little stories that they got in there. These little glimpses of queer lives, like that to me, as a kid, I would have eaten that panel up, and I wanted to put in a lot of elements that would have spoken to me as a kid too. Like, there's this sequence where Stephen like goes into Lion's mane and then pops up upside down, and he speaks upside down. Like that
Yes.
To me, I would have loved that as a kid, turning the comic around and looking at it like that. So I wanted these little. I imagine somebody reading it over and over and over again, and that mattered to me. Sort of having that kind of. As much as it makes the poor artist suffer to have to draw all these crowd sequences.
No, but it's totally paid off. And like, I love that Stephen went out of his way to go and include Lars and the off colors through the portal in Pride by like throwing the confetti on them.
Yeah, the off colors matter a lot. I mean, they are particularly queer, right? Like, they are sort of this. What matters to me in my own, I would do some work with Rainbow Railroad here in Toronto. Rainbow Railroad works with queer refugees, trying to get them out of places where they're unsafe to somewhere they can live with more dignity and with more out lives, whether that's to Canada or whether that's just, 2 countries over from where they might be. And the off-colors to me are sort of that queer diaspora that we need to keep in mind, the sort of the people who are out there who can't be as out as we can and who can't be at Pride. The people we can't always access and can't always save, but have to keep in mind, I think is important. I know this is a lot. This is heavy for a children's comic, but like that's what I wanted this to be about, is sort of like to think about the different facets of the queer experience that intersect and do not intersect at Pride.
Yeah, no, I think that you do absolutely capture that, and that's important for kids to see in those ways as well. When talking about Steven Universe, like a lot, like we talk about like what's important for kids to see, and I know a lot of adults, for example, who totally get how important Steven Universe is for children, or who say like, oh, if I had kids, this is totally a show I would watch, I would have them watch, or, when my kids are a little bit older, we totally have to go check this out together, but who don't really understand the appeal for it. Like, I don't have kids. We've always joked like that I have the DVR of someone who has kids, but,
right.
like the appeal for it as us, as adults. And it's interesting to me, like some fandoms, they sort of grow, the fandom grows up with the cultural subject,
right?
And doesn't necessarily reseed a younger generation, and others it does. And then of course, you and I are of generation. Like I was a full-grown adult with a career before the show was, before Adventure Time was on the air,
right.
Let alone like it grew up with me, which is, but like, so this isn't even like, oh, this show grew up with me. So like, this is, something where, we are adults coming straight into it directly ourselves. And I think one of the conversations that has been particularly active online right now, and that I think is worth, I guess I would say, trying to have us put our minds to, because I'm not really crazy about a lot of quote the discourse quote, is like how and why, like it's okay, and not just okay because it's fun, but okay as in like actually has artistic merit to like engage in these shows, and it's not at the exclusion of also appreciating and participating in conversations around art that is definitely not, all ages inclusive, or that is like less corporate and in its proximity, or things along those lines. And I feel like there's been places where people are pushing feet to be like, you either are on the side of like Marvel, or you're on the side of like, I don't even know what filmmakers they're into. I can tell you which counterculture shit I like.
Right.
They probably don't know them because I'm old, but like,
right.
It's like, are you, and like, I feel like that's really a bad question that people are being asked to, and it's because we used to all understand that we like, one of the movie podcasts I've guested on regularly, is Wrong Reel, and the host says that we cover everything from Jean-Luc Godard to Jean-Luc Picard. And I was like, yeah, like I thought that was understood, you know, like,
yeah, it's a good line, but I don't know that I feel like Jean-Luc Picard could have an interesting conversation with you about Godard, right? Like,
this is true. He is a grown man and an intellectual, but you know, but that one of them is very much American commercial product and the other is not, right? Like, Star Wars is like a radical commercial product that has, you know, been transformed our society and like is great importance and has some very valuable social messages in it and also has problems in it as well, but is still ultimately, you know, corporate in those ways. But anyway, I don't know. I just think like this, we're in this moment right now where I don't know if it's partially because Avengers Endgame is right around the corner. You know, meanwhile, like we do see things like this, like Us, you know, Jordan Peele's movie, like becoming a hugely successful while definitely maintaining sort of an auteurist vision of film.
Right.
It feels like this is a fight people are having a lot right now, and it frustrates me. I've been
watching Twitter have this conversation, and I mean, obviously, I feel very comfortable working in. I can write Steven Universe, but I do a podcast where we just literally just annotate Paradise Lost, right? Like one of the great alienatingly complicated texts of the English canon. And I think that the trying to parse them as different to me is such a pointless and valueless conversation. Like, I always think of Mark Twain has this famous letter where he was like, sorry, this letter is so long, I didn't have time to write a shorter one. And I think that's sort of true of things like Steven Universe. Like, it is something that does not let you see how much work it takes to be so spare and how much work it takes to be so simple. Children's literature is the hardest genre of literature to write because it has to say a lot in as few lines as possible, right? Like, there's a reason texts like the Tao of Pooh emerge after Winnie the Pooh, right? Like, because we recognize in its afterlife that the text is saying 900 different things that a child maybe doesn't register, doesn't have the means to express, but there's still truths in them and there's something elemental in them. But the flip side of this is that the idea of like popularity of whether or not something is pop culture indicating its sophistication is so funny to me. Like, Virgil's Aeneid is the Marvel movies of its day. It's sort of sponsored by the most military. It is literally a text. The patron of it was the emperor, right? It is a text designed to celebrate the glory of the Roman Empire. It is a text that is pro-war in the same way that these Marvel movies are sort of funded by these various military interests. And to be like, oh, well, I'm going to read the Aeneid this weekend instead of seeing the Marvel movie. It's like, these things are not different. These things are in dialogue with one another, and they become a way to read each other. To me, Captain America and Bucky are not intelligible without Achilles and Patroclus, right?
Woohoo!
And I just don't understand why it is we feel like we have to denigrate some elements, some texts, over and against others. And it's a conversation we're having now in pop culture, which is hilarious because I fled academia because of the exact opposite conversation where it's like, well, we can't talk about this text. We have to talk about this text from 400 years ago. And it's like, I love teaching, I love students, but it was so funny to me that they were reading Shakespeare at the expense of seeing what was on Netflix that weekend, when if Shakespeare were alive today, he would be writing for Netflix, right?
Oh, yeah, completely.
Like, why do you have to wait for something to reach a vintage of 400 years before you're allowed to consume it as high art?
Yep, yeah. This was definitely mass culture. I mean, I think that what the critics now, the ones who have nuance rather than the ones who just need to be like ignored because this is not an intelligent conversation in the slightest, but the ones who have some nuance, I think one of their points is a question of like the focus on like art that is ultimately like being made by where there's decisions that are being made that are not being that are part of like a broader program of marketing it as a product that like limits its ability to do what it might want to do without those considerations. And of course, like independent movies are limited by their ability to access budget, etc. But that, you know, making the overlords happy is a different dynamic than trying to keep my budget down to within my, like, it's not this, everything has constraint. And, you know, one of the things we love about classic Hollywood movies is the queer subtext, which is only exists because people weren't allowed to just do what they wanted to do, whatever. But like, you know, and but also again, the question of like, are you looking at art that is like also just supposed, the thing, Steven Universe, I really look at it as truly being like a healing piece of culture and media.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's about helping people develop understanding of nonviolent conflict resolution while also offering enough violence to actually be interesting.
Right.
And it's about, it teaches like healthy relationships and sending boundaries. And it's an incredibly instructive text. And we don't need all art to do that.
I sort of bristle at the idea of that all art should be therapeutic or that art should be non-problematic. I think that, and again, this maybe is generational, but maybe not. Like, I am used to having to do certain work to make a text be what I need it to be, and I think that there is something sort of exhausting about people who demand texts come pre-buffed. That like you can work through a problem and still, especially if that problem is your own sort of trauma, you do have a license in art to make the kind of art you need to make. I think that if we're going to treat art as therapeutic, we should surely at least treat it as therapeutic for the artist, if nothing else. And I find, as much as Steven Universe is a healing, I think you're absolutely right. Steven Universe is a healing text. Steven Universe is a text that is modeling an ideal of behavior for children. It is also, in some ways, about a genocide, right? It was an attempt by this invasionary colonizing force to inflict a new map onto our planet, right? And it doesn't take much to look under the rock of that. Like, it is accessible as a text about colonialism without doing much work to recoup that. And I think that suggesting you can't depict those things is such a strange moment I think we're entering right now.
I don't think that people are suggesting you can't depict things that are, I mean, some people are, but like things that are bad, but I think that there's a lot more concern about like, oh, is this media modeling healthy behavior, or are the good guys, is it validating morality in a way that's like completely going back to the Hays Code, Hollywood, where like even Rebel Without a Cause like is a remarkably status quo supporting movie.
I'm finding the version of this I'm thinking about right now is that Joker trailer just dropped. And the conversation has been about like, well, are we just depicting sympathy for another mass murdering white guy? That's an interesting conversation to have to me, but I do think it comes up against a very old idea, and an idea that maybe we're not really looking at the contours of right now, which is that like there is something kind of puritanical about suggesting that you can't make a kind of art that might lead to dangerous thoughts, right? Mm-hmm. You can't model sympathy for the devil, right? You can't model, as much as I am sort of, I'm mostly bored by these narratives more than anything.
That was my feeling, right?
We've had a lot of, I don't know, maybe the film's amazing, but we've had a lot of these sort of disaffected white male jokers. What if you suggested something else? What if you where you spend your sympathy points to me is always the most telling thing. I'm always like, if a person has 20 sympathy points a day, it is not apolitical where they spend them, and that to me matters.
And if I want to watch a movie about a white guy outsider, like, I mean, I could just watch
all of them.
All of them, right. But some of them were
Taxi
actually made by great...
Driver.
Taxi Driver, yeah, exactly. Some of them were made by great filmmakers. I enjoy Scorsese. I haven't seen Taxi Driver in a lifetime. I don't actually like Taxi Driver very much even. But, like, if I was going to do it, I would just watch Taxi Driver. I would not watch the Warner Brothers branded Taxi Driver remake. And, I would,
I mean, I don't know. Like, to me, if they were like, hey, do you want to write a Joker movie? There's elements of that trailer that would be the elements I would think about. Like, what would it mean to have someone attempt to pursue an ethos of kindness and have it sort of broken over their back over and over again? Like, that is to me I'm interested in questions of kindness. I'm interested in them when it comes to Steven Universe. I'm interested in them when it comes to the Joker. I'm interested in them when it comes to Shazam, right? Like Shazam, I just saw this weekend, and I think we were talking about how you just saw it. It's like, what interested me about that film is like, it is sort of asking seriously about the, is there something about the superhero ethic that actually could be is this actually what we believe? Do we actually believe a person could be a superhero? And that is an active question right now. Like when in a moment where you have Zack Snyder being like, well, of course Superman kills people, of course Batman kills people. Who are you kidding? Like this desire to grow up is coming from both sides of this question. Like, well, you have to be cynical, and well, you have to grow up and therefore can't depict anything that's a problem. I think that we need to allow a broader band, and especially we need to be better about avenues of forgiveness and a discourse that is capacious and generous to queer creators in a way that we are very bad about. We let these monoliths promise, oh, someday we'll give you a queer character, and like, oh, maybe that moment was kind of gay, and we applaud them, and we heap awards on like what's her name? The View McCain.
Meg fucking McCain.
Yeah, like Meg McCain can win an LGBT award, but as soon as a queer creator comes along and depicts something, it's like, well, this language in this scene is no good, and this relationship is problematic, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the double standard. I mean, I think part of it is because people don't expect better from some of those people, but they shouldn't be doing that then. You know what I mean? And meanwhile, it's much easier to punch down. It's much easier to like gang up on other queer people online than to address people with like greater social power.
Yeah, because you can very effectively, a well-placed tweet can very effectively end a budding career, right? Like a well-placed tweet will not end Zack Snyder's career, but it'll end like the latest 8-page queer web comic, you know, like very easily. And the internet is forever, and we're not good about allowing space for forgiveness. And we've also kind of, in strange ways, overestimated fiction's capacity. I mean, I don't... The Joker is a good example. The Joker has a real-life body count, right? Like, we have very real killers who have cited the Joker. Like, the Nolan Joker especially was the inspiration for, what's his name? It's probably not even worth saying his name, but, like...
one of them. One of the ones with really stupid hair, yeah.
And that, to me, that is what these texts are for, is like... They let us have conversations about real-life stakes, and they do have real life stakes, and I think that that is the danger for an artist, to forget that, because the world of Batman and the Joker can go there, or it can give you like Bat-Kid. It can give you that kid who's like, they turned San Francisco into Gotham and he went on an adventure, right? Like there is something, this comes out of my Catholic background. There's something salvific about these texts, and there's something dangerous about these texts, and the stories you tell have real stakes, and where you spend those sympathy points matters. But it doesn't mean you have to create pure, perfect, orthodox texts. I think that the risk is that we supplant the old Christian, the Hays Code, etc., but we now assert a new one where now we have texts full of queer characters, but none of them are in any way troubled. None of them have pasts we don't like. None of them perform acts we don't like, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's a conversation all minority communities eventually go through, where it's like you go through an unfortunate example given his current history, but like the Cosby Show is a version of this, right? Where you have to play the respectability politics game, and you get these depictions of Black life that are not really real depictions of Black life, but are sort of this idealized version of it. And I feel like maybe queerness is headed towards that same kind of moment, where it's like, now they're here, but like you can never break up North Star and his husband, because that would suggest queer relationships don't last, and like, you know, like we have to perform this sort of perfect paragon of ourselves instead of flaws and individual foibles.
Well, I mean, yes, you know, that's what we always say, like this, what we need then is more of them. Like if you have a lot of queer couples, then you can break some of them up. Like if you have, you know what I mean? If you have lots of queer characters, then some of them can be awesome campy villains, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. And by the same token, I was just catching up on Voltron the other day. Mm-hmm. One of these texts that sort of was playing the same chicken game with queer representation, realized it had boxed itself in and sort of had to retroactively change the nature of two queer characters' relationships. But in so doing, had to like generate a new queer character to sort of solve the new musical chairs problem they had created. Like, they knew the fan base would lose their mind that what was seeming to be a romantic relationship was actually now coded as almost like a paternal one, like a father-son one. If you ever want to see a messy, toxic discourse, check out the Voltron one. And what's funny to me is,
I'm so happy and excited about how I didn't. Like, for a minute there, I was like, I should probably know about this. I said, no, Ilana, no. You found that show to be high production value, low narrative value.
Well,
and you're not going to pay attention to this. When they tell you that there's like an actual, like, sorry. Please continue.
No, it's a fascinating case test of exactly what we're talking about. Like, because the fandom sort of claws at each other without sort of recognizing the game that was played within the realm of the text, that the text sort of purposely rendered itself problematic to sort of cut off the shipping element that was happening, and it became like, you can't ship them now because that's a problematic relationship, when in fact that was like a much later instantiation of the text. It's really fascinating and interesting and thorny, and it becomes immediately quite amazingly toxic to me. And it's an imposition from a writer, right? Like a cast of writers put that together, and I really like Voltron.
For our listeners who aren't playing along, so tell me if this is accurate. So there's characters who fans like saw as having a subtextually gay relationship with each other.
Yes.
The show did not like that people were reading that into it, so it decided to then begin writing those two characters as having a more
I can't
father
speak
figure child type relationship.
Yeah, I can't
and then
speak
people
to
who were a fan of the
intentionality.
earlier ship were accused of being into like pedophilia, not pedophilia. No, that was today. Accused of being into like incest or whatever. Like, is
yeah,
that
it has like a. The show was initially vague about characters' ages. It was initially vague about relationships. But if you watch, even in the pilot episode, there's two characters who are clearly in a close homosocial relationship, in that they are each other's, in the same way Captain America and Bucky has never risen to the level of a romantic relationship in the text. But in as much as the Captain America movies are about Steve's love for someone, they're sort of structured by this. Or like, you can't have the movie The Civil War without have that love, right? Like, and there's a long arc that built into Voltron that deals with all this stuff. But then all of a sudden we started getting flashbacks like, oh, he was a child. And it's like, it became a way to sort of not have 2 of the 5 coded as queer. But then as soon as this happens, a secondary love interest we've never heard of emerges from the past. And suddenly it's like, oh, he had a boyfriend the whole time. He's still queer. 1 of the 5 is queer. And he has this boyfriend who immediately then dies, right? Like,
oh, wow.
And it's fun watching texts play this kind of musical chairsy game. But it's also unfortunate watching the audience then turn on itself because of it. It's really fascinating to me. And it is, of course, now a problematic relationship. Like, I don't want to suggest it's not. It is absolutely problematic and looks like grooming, et cetera, et cetera. But the point to me seems to have been to make it problematic so that now it's the only way to immunize yourself against critique of not fulfilling that relationship is to make it become, it's a fascinating strategy to me, is to, you can turn a text problematic so that you don't have to deal with something you didn't want to have to deal with.
That is so cynical and homophobic to do.
Well, I can't speak to intention. And like I said, I actually I like Voltron a lot as sort of, there's this kind of thread of Canadian sci-fi that Voltron is a part of, like Battlestar Galactica and like Mass Effect, this sort of clean-lined, ponderous ships engaging in long military battles with like operatic music. It activates all that stuff for me. So I like it as a text. I would love to write it, but but yeah, its depiction of queerness to me is so fascinating and messy, and I like the mess of it too.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, thank you for that insight. Like, I feel like that particular, I feel like it was worth going into this Voltron question because it's the sort of thing that I can see playing out in lots of. Well, 1, because I wanted some clarity about it without having to do the work myself, but 2. Because it's something I can see playing out in other places as well.
There's a general thing like shipping. It's become sort of a weapon in these shipping wars, right? Is like, well, your ship is problematic and mine is the one true clean Like there is something puritanical and something
Yeah.
evoking the language of hygiene about these things that to a 90s kid like me is completely alien, right? Like you took what you could get. But now we demand this purity of the text that it maybe it's in some ways a productive impulse because it does mean better, fuller representation, but it also means they look less like real people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Like, I feel like there's 80 other things I also want to discuss. So hopefully this means that you can come back in the near future.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I again, like, I'm happy to be back whenever.
And I want to talk about the religious subtext from Steven Universe when the show does come back, which I still feel like that finale felt like a real finale to me.
Didn't it really? Like, I know,
Yeah.
like, I mean, there's things still to talk about. I would love to see it run another 10 years, but as a series, occasionally shows have a perfect ending in the middle of the show. Like Buffy had this in season 5, where it's like, that's the most perfect series finale you could have had. And they continue, and who knows if the ending will keep going, but it's like, so many things wrapped up so beautifully, and like I just sat there crying for 3 minutes when it was ending.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I like I said on the episode where we covered it, like, I think if there is going to be more, which there is, we know, but like, I think what's missing is sort of how do the gems integrate with Earth now? Like, they don't really have, like, there's still, like, Ronaldo still thinks they're snake people. You know what I mean? Like, how do the gems reconcile with Earthlings? Like, in a broader way. I think
it's one of those things that I think are so fascinating in queer texts is like what happens after the good apocalypse, the eupocalypse. Like what happens when all your dreams come true? Like it's sort of the thing that the Matrix also sort of tried to figure out. Like, okay, you didn't defeat the machines, now you live with the machines. What happens now? You know, achieving some kind of synthesis, again, Mass Effect, like over and against the annihilation of your foe, right? Like there was no great final death at the end of Steven Universe. Instead, it's sort of just like forgiveness for everybody. What does it look like? What does it look like to forgive the orchestrators of like multi-hundred planetary colonization efforts, right? Like there's blood on those gems' hands that is not dealt with. And I like the idea.
A lot of people have pointed out to that as being like the big hole in this conclusion is like, what if we're not all okay with forgiving the diamonds?
Yeah, and it's an interesting. It is a pressure you can put on Steven Universe, right? Like forgiveness. Are you suggesting a radical forgiveness that truly does forgive everybody? What does it mean? What kind of violence does such a forgiveness enact? Again, it comes to the question of sympathy points, right? Like, well, by giving your sympathy to these characters, how many characters' lives and deaths have you effaced? I think that's an active question that could be explored, right? Like, what does it mean to have no try? I mean, I'm obsessed with Hannah Arendt. Like, what does it mean to forgive as a gesture, as like an exercise of power?
So I look forward to having you on to talk about that, as well as the religious symbolism, because that was the thing. We didn't really talk about the religious symbolism as much as I think it merited on our last one. I am very proud of our Steven Universe episode, by the way, and I do think folks should go listen to it. But I feel like that would be another area we could use some build up around. So hopefully we can have you join us for that, and perhaps with another War of a Star type thing.
I'm 100% down for anything you want to have me on for.
Well, fabulous.
Thank you for having me
so much. Have a great week.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, this is Graphic Policy Radio. You can find me on Twitter at ELANA_Brooklyn. Graphic Policy is at graphicpolicy.com. We're on iTunes and SoundCloud. And we will be back soon. Keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.